Hi, and thanks for watching this message video / life lesson. And don't forget that for those who can't make a Sunday, that there's a podcast of that sermon that goes along with this message video, kind of a part 1, part 2 thing. Today, we're continuing on in our series called Crescendo, where we're using the word figuratively to describe the loud things that Jesus did that announced his role as the Messiah and the loud things that we can do as his followers. And today we're going to discuss the 2 different times when Jesus did mass feedings of all kinds of different people. And according to Matthew, prior to this time when he fed the 5,000, which is not including any women or children, that Jesus had been performing lots of different miracles on all kinds of people who were Jewish in this area of Galilee, and that the ruler of that area, Herod Antipas, had actually heard the loud noise of this crescendo and had become aware of it. In fact, here's what we're told. Matthew 4:23 through 25 and 14:1 through 2. Jesus traveled throughout the region of Galilee, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom. And he healed every kind of disease and illness. News about him spread as far as Syria, and people soon began bringing to him all who were sick. And whatever their sickness or disease, or if they were demon-possessed or epileptic or paralyzed, he healed them all. Large crowds followed him wherever he went, people from Galilee, the 10 towns, Jerusalem, from all over Judea, and from east of the Jordan River. When Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, heard about Jesus, he said to his advisors, "This must be John the Baptist, raised from the dead. That is why he can do such miracles." Based on the brief description we're given in this passage, how would you describe the demographics of this crowd that Jesus eventually fed? And, based on Herod's words, what can we assume about his religious beliefs? When it comes to any statistical data or the demographics of this crowd, we don't know where to find that for sure, but based upon what we're told, I think it's easy to assume that this was a very poor crowd, that this group of people didn't have the means with which to work or provide for themselves. And so Jesus was targeting this group of people who were the sick, maybe the diseased, for a very specific reason, and that maybe he knew that these people would talk a lot about the things that he was doing in their lives in order to provide healing, miraculous healing. And if that was his plan, it certainly worked because Herod Antipas heard about it. Now, he had John the Baptist beheaded, and so to believe that Jesus was John's ghost implies this about him. Herod Antipas not only believed in the afterlife, but he potentially felt vindicated about murdering John, or ultimately viewed it as a blessing for those under his rule. But we know it wasn't John's ghost. So do the people who were there. In fact, look at what it is that we're told happened when Jesus fed this first crowd. Matthew 14:13 through 21. As soon as Jesus heard the news about John being murdered, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. That evening the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said, "That isn't necessary. You feed them." "But we have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here," he said. Then he told the people to sit down in the grass. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up toward heaven and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples who distributed it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterwards the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. Do you think everyone in the crowd knew their Lunchable was a miracle? Explain your answer. And if you were one of Jesus' disciples for this first feeding, would you have told others about what you experienced? Explain your answer. And why do you think Jesus went away to be alone after hearing about John's death? And what can we learn from this? Like with Jesus, when we hear of someone's passing, even if we know that it's coming, and Jesus certainly knew that John's death was coming, it's still hard. But like with Jesus, the best thing to do afterwards, even if we're going to go and talk with somebody else, it's to ultimately take it to God. And he will help us. He will give us the strength that we need to do what it is that we need to do. And in Jesus' situation, he knew what he needed to do was to feed a lot of people. Now, we don't know for sure if initially they knew that it was Jesus that provided their lunch, but over time were absolutely certain that everybody knew that it was Jesus. And one of the reasons why is because the disciples and the way that they would have talked or the way that other people would have talked about that, miraculous things get talked about. That's the idea of the crescendo. Now, this whole idea of there being leftovers, this is one of the most important things in this story, in that one of the things that was happening, or I should say one of the things that was not happening, was that Jesus was getting caught up in all of the emotion and just decided to kind of flex his supernatural muscle and got a little carried away with the miraculousness of it all. No, that's not what that's not what happened. When Jesus fed the crowds, the purpose of the leftovers was to show the 12 disciples that giving to God what little they had allowed him to multiply it for kingdom use, and that in the end they received back more than what they started with. Or in other words, with the combined contributions of all 12 of the disciples, they couldn't fill really one basket. But after they gave it to God, they received back everything that they got plus more. Or in other words, they each got back what the equivalent was of one basket. This principle of giving, that when we give to God, God gives us back more than what we gave, is something Jesus not only taught on, it's clearly something he demonstrated to the disciples when feeding the crowds. But as many of you know, the disciples were difficult to train. So Jesus decided to do this mass feeding thing a second time. But the second time, Jesus took the disciples to an area of Lake Galilee or the Sea of Galilee that was known as Gennesaret, an area that the people had massive pagan influences and very little connection whatsoever to Judaism. They didn't really know their God, so to speak. And so look at what it is that Jesus did when he showed compassion to them and even what he said. Matthew 15:30 through 38. A vast crowd brought to him people who were lame, blind, crippled, those who couldn't speak, and many others. They laid them before Jesus, and he healed them all. The crowd was amazed. Those who hadn't been able to speak were talking. The crippled were made well. The lame were walking, and the blind could see again. And they praised the God of Israel. Then Jesus called his disciples and told them, I feel sorry for these people. They have been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, or they will faint along the way. The disciples replied, Where will we get enough food here in the wilderness for such a huge crowd? Jesus asked, How much bread do you have? They replied, 7 loaves and a few small fish. So Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to the disciples, who distributed the food to the crowd. They all ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were 4,000 men who were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. Do you think the disciples struggled with Jesus showing compassion to this pagan-influenced crowd of people? Explain your answer. Knowing the leftovers are important, why do you think there were 7 large baskets of leftovers this time instead of 12 small baskets? Explain your answer. From these lessons, what did Jesus want the disciples and us to learn about living loud for him? When it comes to the mass feedings that Jesus performed, and the leftovers from them, whether it was 12 baskets or 7 baskets, both of those have significance in terms of the meaning. But what the disciples learned in both of these situations was the real strategy that Jesus had in terms of who to target with the good news and how to target them. Meaning, what the disciples learned is that the good news is for everybody, but specifically, what God wanted them to do was to take it to those who were the most unhelped in society, to those who were maybe the most poverty-stricken, or in other words, to the poor. And furthermore, that whatever it is that they gave to God in order to be able to help or to assist the poor, that God would always give it back to them, plus some, plus more. These are the things that the disciples and us are supposed to learn from these stories. And because they're both so important, it's what I'm going to be talking about on Sunday, and I hope you can join me.